Captain Jake Sullivan had trained for combat, evasion, and survival. But nothing prepared him for this: 12 wounded soldiers depending on him to carry them 50 miles through enemy territory to safety. The military code was clear: leave no man behind, but how do you carry 12 men when you're only one? Jake was about to discover what those words really meant when everything depended on keeping that promise. In the rugged mountains of eastern Afghanistan, UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter call sign, Dust-Off 77, was conducting what intelligence had classified as a routine medical evacuation mission. Captain Jake Sullivan, a 15-year veteran pilot with over 3,000 flight hours in combat zones, commanded an experienced crew transporting 4 wounded soldiers from a forward operating base back to the main medical facility. Jake's crew represented the best of military aviation: co-pilot Lieutenant Mike Davis, a sharp young officer with exceptional navigational skills and steady nerves under pressure; Flight Engineer Staff Sergeant Carlos Martinez, a mechanical genius who could fix anything that flew and had kept dozens of helicopters operational through multiple deployments; Door Gunner Corporal Tommy Johnson, a former infantry soldier who had transitioned to aviation and possessed both combat experience and protective instincts for wounded personnel; Flight Medic Staff Sergeant Rachel Wilson, a combat veteran with advanced medical training who had saved countless lives during her 4 deployments. The 4 wounded passengers they were transporting had been injured during a previous engagement and were stable enough for routine evacuation: Private Anderson with shrapnel wounds that were healing well, Corporal Thompson recovering from burns sustained during a vehicle fire, Sergeant Williams with a leg injury that was responding to treatment, and Private Garcia suffering from a concussion but showing steady improvement. At 0930 hours on what appeared to be a clear Tuesday morning, the mission parameters seemed straightforward. Weather conditions were optimal with clear skies and excellent visibility. They were flying through friendly airspace with no reported enemy activity, and the estimated flight time to their destination was 30 minutes covering 50 miles of familiar terrain. Jake checked his GPS display showing their current position and calculated arrival time while maintaining radio contact with base operations. Everything indicated a routine flight that would conclude another successful medical evacuation mission. At 0947 hours, everything changed in an instant. RPG. RPG. Right side. Corporal Johnson's warning cut through the helicopter's communication system like a knife. The rocket-propelled grenade struck Black Hawk's tail rotor assembly with devastating precision, immediately compromising the aircraft's directional control and sending it into an uncontrolled spin that no amount of pilot skill could overcome. Mayday! Mayday! This is Black Hawk Dust-Off 77 going down. Grid coordinates 41, Romeo, Quebec, Sierra, 12345-67890. Jake transmitted his emergency call while fighting the flight controls that were no longer responding to his inputs. The impact with the rocky mountainous terrain was tremendous, sending shock waves through the aircraft structure as metal twisted, bent, and broke under forces that exceeded every design specification. Jake lost consciousness momentarily as the helicopter's emergency systems activated and the cabin filled with smoke, debris, and the acrid smell of burning electronics. When Jake regained consciousness, he found himself suspended in his pilot seat, blood trickling from a cut above his left eye, with his entire body aching from the crash impact. The Black Hawk was completely destroyed, its rotor blades scattered across a 100-meter area, its fuselage cracked open like an eggshell, and its sophisticated electronic systems reduced to sparking wreckage. Jake extracted himself from the wreckage and immediately began assessing the human cost of their shootdown. The methodical training that had been drilled into him during years of military service took over as he moved from casualty to casualty, checking vital signs, evaluating injuries, and determining who could be saved and who was beyond help. His crew and passengers had sustained varying degrees of injury from the crash impact, transforming what had been a routine medical evacuation into a crisis that would test every aspect of Jake's character, training, and determination. Co-pilot Lieutenant Davis was unconscious with obvious head trauma, possible internal injuries from impact with his control panel, and irregular breathing that indicated serious medical complications requiring immediate attention. Flight engineer Martinez was conscious but suffering from a compound fracture of his left leg that had occurred when debris struck his position during the crash. The bone was protruding through skin, bleeding was significant, and he was unable to support his own weight. Door Gunner Johnson had sustained a bullet wound to his shoulder from enemy fire during the crash sequence, resulting in substantial blood loss and reduced mobility in his left arm, though he remained conscious and alert. Flight medic Wilson was conscious despite suffering multiple rib fractures that made breathing painful and movement difficult, but she retained enough mobility to assist with medical assessment of other casualties. The 4 original wounded passengers now required even more intensive medical care due to complications from the crash. Private Anderson's healing shrapnel wounds had reopened during impact, causing renewed bleeding and increased pain that left him unable to move independently. Corporal Thompson's burn injuries had been aggravated by exposure to hot metal and debris during the crash, expanding the affected area and increasing his risk of infection and shock. Sergeant Williams's recovering leg injury had been severely compromised by the crash impact, essentially resetting his healing process and rendering him completely immobile. Private Garcia's concussion symptoms had worsened significantly due to secondary impact during the crash, leaving him confused, nauseous, and unable to maintain balance when attempting to stand. Additionally, the crash had created 4 new casualties among soldiers who had been uninjured before the shootdown. Specialist Rodriguez had sustained a back injury when thrown against the helicopter's interior bulkhead, resulting in severe pain and inability to stand or walk without assistance. Private Miller had suffered a fractured ankle when caught beneath shifting equipment during the crash sequence, making weight-bearing movement impossible and causing constant pain. Sergeant Brown was showing signs of internal bleeding, evidenced by abdominal pain, pale complexion, and episodes of nausea that suggested serious internal injuries requiring immediate medical intervention. Corporal Lee had dislocated his shoulder during the crash impact, rendering his left arm completely useless and causing significant pain that limited his overall mobility. Jake's quick mental calculation revealed the full scope of their crisis: 12 wounded soldiers requiring various levels of medical care and physical assistance, with only one able-bodied person, himself, capable of providing that assistance across 50 miles of hostile enemy territory. Approximately 30 minutes after the crash, Jake detected the first signs of enemy forces moving toward their position. The distinctive sound of vehicle engines and human voices carried across the mountainous terrain, indicating that their shootdown had been observed and enemy combatants were approaching to investigate the wreckage and eliminate any survivors. "Everyone who can move needs to find defensive positions immediately," Jake whispered to his conscious soldiers while helping them relocate to cover behind rocks and debris. The tactical situation was desperate. Only Wilson and Jake possessed enough mobility to potentially engage enemy forces, but Wilson's rib injury severely limited her combat effectiveness. The remaining soldiers were either unconscious or too badly injured to participate in defensive operations. Through binoculars salvaged from the wreckage, Jake observed the approaching enemy force, 3 pickup trucks carrying approximately 15 armed combatants who were systematically searching the crash area for survivors and valuable equipment. Jake realized immediately that a defensive stand was tactically impossible. His wounded soldiers couldn't fight effectively, couldn't retreat quickly, and couldn't survive extended combat engagement. The only viable option was immediate evacuation from the crash site before enemy forces could establish control of the area. "Wilson," Jake whispered urgently, "we need to execute emergency evacuation procedures right now." "Sir, how can we possibly evacuate? Most of these soldiers can't walk, let alone travel 50 miles through hostile territory." Jake looked at his wounded soldiers, remembering the military code that had been emphasized throughout his training since basic military education: leave no one behind. The phrase had seemed straightforward during classroom instruction, but now it represented an seemingly impossible challenge that would require everything he possessed as a leader, soldier, and human being. Jake quickly inventoried their salvageable equipment and supplies: 1 partially functional radio with limited range capability, a scattered collection of medical supplies including bandages and pain medication, several water bottles that had survived the crash, ammunition for their personal weapons, a topographical map of the region, a magnetic compass, and various pieces of survival equipment. The total weight of essential equipment exceeded what one person could carry during extended movement while simultaneously assisting wounded personnel. Jake would be forced to make difficult decisions about what supplies to carry and what to abandon. Enemy voices were becoming increasingly audible as the search parties moved closer to their position. Jake faced the most critical decision of his military career: attempt to establish radio communication with friendly forces and remain in position to wait for rescue, or begin an immediate evacuation through 50 miles of hostile territory with 12 wounded soldiers. "Wilson, help me prepare everyone for movement. We're walking out of here." "Sir, 50 miles through enemy territory with 12 wounded soldiers? That's tactically impossible and probably suicidal." "Wilson, the military code doesn't include exceptions for difficult circumstances. We don't abandon wounded soldiers because the mission is challenging. We find a way to complete the mission regardless of personal cost." Jake began implementing an evacuation plan that violated every tactical manual he had ever studied but represented the only option that didn't involve abandoning wounded soldiers to certain death or capture. Jake used wreckage from the Black Hawk helicopter to construct improvised stretchers and carrying devices for soldiers who couldn't walk independently. Aluminum panels became stretcher frames, seat cushions provided padding for wounded soldiers, and torn fabric was fashioned into carrying straps and support systems. Each wounded soldier presented unique challenges that required individual solutions. Lieutenant Davis, still unconscious with head trauma, required a full stretcher carry with careful attention to head and neck stabilization to prevent additional injury during movement. Staff Sergeant Martinez, with his compound leg fracture, needed a supportive carrying system that would immobilize the injured limb while allowing Jake to transport him without causing additional bone damage. Corporal Johnson, suffering from blood loss due to his shoulder wound, required frequent rest stops and careful monitoring to prevent shock and further deterioration of his condition. The remaining 9 wounded soldiers each presented different carrying requirements based on their specific injuries, ranging from partial weight support during walking to complete carrying assistance for extended periods. Jake established a rotation system that would allow him to assist different soldiers throughout their evacuation while preventing any individual from being abandoned due to the physical demands of extended carrying. "Listen carefully," Jake addressed all conscious soldiers while preparing for their departure. "We have 50 miles to travel through hostile territory to reach friendly lines. We'll move slowly, we'll move quietly, and most importantly, we'll move together as a unit. Nobody gets left behind, regardless of circumstances." Day 1 of their evacuation march resulted in 8 miles of progress over 12 hours of continuous movement through challenging mountainous terrain. Jake's physical endurance was tested immediately as he alternated between carrying different wounded soldiers on improvised stretchers and supporting walking wounded who required assistance to maintain forward movement. The carrying rotation began with Lieutenant Davis, whose unconscious condition required complete support and careful handling to prevent additional head trauma. Jake carried Davis for 2-hour periods before switching to Corporal Johnson, whose blood loss made extended walking impossible. Staff Sergeant Wilson assisted Sergeant Martinez with walking support despite her own rib injuries, while other wounded soldiers helped each other maintain movement as their individual conditions permitted. The terrain presented constant obstacles that complicated their evacuation: rocky hillsides that required careful navigation with stretchers, dense vegetation that slowed their progress and concealed their movement, stream crossings that risked equipment loss and injury to wounded soldiers, and steep inclines that multiplied the physical demands of carrying wounded personnel. Water consumption became an immediate concern as their limited supplies were insufficient for 13 people over the extended time period their evacuation would require. Jake implemented strict rationing procedures, distributing small amounts of water at regular intervals while searching for natural water sources that could supplement their supplies. By nightfall of the first day, Jake's physical condition was already showing signs of the tremendous strain he was undertaking. His back ached constantly from the weight of carrying wounded soldiers, his hands were blistered from gripping stretcher handles, and his leg muscles burned from the additional weight he was supporting during their movement. "Sir," Wilson said privately during their evening rest, "at this pace, we'll never cover 50 miles before our wounded soldiers' conditions become critical. Then we'll improve our pace tomorrow, Wilson. We're not abandoning anyone regardless of the challenges we face. During their first night's rest, enemy patrol vehicles passed within 200 meters of their concealed position, forcing Jake to maintain complete radio silence while keeping wounded soldiers quiet despite their pain and discomfort. Lieutenant Davis briefly regained consciousness during the night, disoriented and confused about their situation. "Jake, where are we? What happened to our helicopter?" "We're taking you home, Davis. Just hang on and let us worry about getting everyone to safety." Night temperatures in the mountains dropped significantly, creating hypothermia risks for wounded soldiers who were unable to generate body heat through movement. Jake shared his jacket and equipment with soldiers showing signs of dangerous temperature loss, sacrificing his own comfort to maintain their core body temperatures. Sleep was impossible for Jake as wounded soldiers required constant attention throughout the night, monitoring vital signs, repositioning soldiers to prevent pressure sores, administering pain medication when available, and maintaining security watch for enemy patrols that continued searching the area. Jake calculated their remaining distance and timeline, 42 miles remaining over approximately 4 days maximum before wounded soldiers' medical conditions would deteriorate beyond the point where evacuation could save their lives. The second morning brought new medical challenges that complicated their evacuation efforts. Lieutenant Davis had lapsed back into unconsciousness, Corporal Johnson's shoulder wound showed signs of renewed bleeding, and Staff Sergeant Martinez's leg fracture was displaying early symptoms of infection that could become life-threatening without proper medical treatment. Jake implemented more stringent resource rationing as their water supply diminished rapidly. Each person received small sips of water every 2 hours, and their remaining food supplies, primarily emergency rations and energy bars, were divided among 13 people, providing minimal nutrition for the physical demands they were facing. Day 2 progress improved to 10 miles covered over 14 hours of movement, representing better efficiency as Jake refined his carrying techniques and the wounded soldiers adapted to their evacuation routine. However, the pace remained inadequate for covering 50 miles within their critical timeframe. Jake's carrying rotation became more systematic as he learned to optimize his physical efforts, Davis during morning hours when Jake's strength was greatest, Johnson during afternoon when medical attention was most critical, Anderson during evening when his shrapnel wounds caused the most pain. Staff Sergeant Wilson continued assisting walking wounded despite her own increasing exhaustion and rib injuries, but Jake recognized that Wilson would soon reach physical collapse, leaving him alone with 13 casualties instead of 12. During the afternoon of Day 2, Sergeant Brown's internal bleeding condition worsened significantly. He began vomiting blood, his skin became pale and clammy, and his pulse became weak and irregular, all indicators of serious internal hemorrhaging that required immediate surgical intervention unavailable in their field conditions. Jake faced an agonizing medical decision: use their remaining morphine supplies to make Brown comfortable, knowing that other wounded soldiers would have to endure significant pain without pharmaceutical relief, or conserve the medication for soldiers with better survival prospects. "Brown, stay with me. We're getting you home to your family," Jake said while administering the morphine injection. Brown whispered weakly, "Sir, don't waste effort carrying dead weight. Save your strength for soldiers who can make it. Brown, you're coming home with us, and that's not open for discussion." However, privately Jake understood the grim medical reality: Brown might not survive another day of evacuation, and carrying him would consume energy that could potentially save other wounded soldiers with better survival chances. The morning of Day 3 brought the devastating news that Jake had been dreading. Sergeant Brown had died during the night, succumbing to internal bleeding that exceeded their field medical capabilities. Jake felt Brown's death as a personal failure, questioning whether different decisions could have saved the soldier's life. The remaining personnel count stood at 12 wounded soldiers under increasingly desperate conditions, with Jake's physical and mental state deteriorating rapidly under the constant stress of carrying wounded soldiers across hostile territory. Jake faced the difficult decision regarding Brown's remains. Their situation didn't allow time for proper burial ceremonies, enemy pursuit continued, and the living soldiers required all available energy for evacuation. Jake removed Brown's dog tags, whispered a brief prayer, and continued the march while carrying the emotional weight of leaving a fallen soldier behind. Day 3 progress reached 12 miles over 16 hours of continuous movement, representing Jake's best daily performance despite his increasing exhaustion. Jake was now carrying wounded soldiers constantly with no rest periods, as Wilson had collapsed twice from physical exhaustion and could no longer provide meaningful assistance. Water supplies reached critical levels, forcing Jake to take calculated risks by refilling bottles from mountain streams despite the high probability of waterborne contamination that could create additional medical complications. By the evening of Day 3, Jake was experiencing hallucinations caused by severe exhaustion, dehydration, and psychological stress. He occasionally saw family members who weren't present, heard voices calling his name from empty terrain, and experienced momentary confusion about their location and mission objectives. "Sir," Lieutenant Davis said during one of his conscious periods, "you need to rest. You're showing signs of dangerous exhaustion." "Can't rest, Davis. Enemy forces are still behind us, and we have 28 miles ahead of us. Sir, if you collapse, we all die. You have to rest for at least 2 hours." Jake reluctantly agreed to a brief rest period while Wilson maintained security watch, but his sleep was filled with disturbing dreams about his wife Sarah and daughter Emma waiting for him at home, contrasted with his promises to bring wounded soldiers home safely, conflicting commitments that created psychological pressure beyond normal human tolerance. The morning of Day 4 found Jake more determined than ever to complete their evacuation mission. 28 miles remained with approximately 2 days available before wounded soldiers' conditions became unsurvivable, requiring a dramatic increase in their daily progress. Jake implemented a new strategy that prioritized speed over comfort, longer carrying periods, faster movement pace, fewer rest stops, and acceptance of higher risks to achieve the distance necessary for mission success. He carried Lieutenant Davis for 3 consecutive hours, despite severe cramping in his arms and back spasms that made movement agonizing. Wilson attempted to assist by carrying Corporal Johnson, but collapsed after 1 hour of effort, leaving Jake to carry both Davis and Johnson in alternating periods while maintaining forward progress. Day 4 achieved 15 miles over 18 hours of movement, representing their best daily progress yet, but Jake's physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. His hands were bleeding from constant friction with carrying equipment, his back muscles were in constant spasm, and his legs trembled from exhaustion when he attempted to rest. During the afternoon of Day 4, an enemy patrol spotted their movement across open terrain, forcing Jake to make a desperate tactical decision that could save or doom their entire evacuation effort. 3 vehicles carrying approximately 12 enemy combatants were approaching their position with clear intent to capture or eliminate the American soldiers. Jake's wounded personnel couldn't fight, couldn't run, and couldn't hide effectively in the available terrain. "Wilson, take the wounded soldiers into that rocky area and keep them quiet. I'm going to draw the enemy away from your position." Jake ran in the opposite direction from his wounded soldiers, making noise, leaving obvious trail markers, and creating distractions that would focus enemy attention on his individual movement rather than the group location. He led the enemy patrol on a chase through difficult terrain for over 2 hours before they abandoned their pursuit and returned to their vehicles. Jake returned to the wounded soldiers' location after dark, only to find Wilson unconscious from exhaustion and stress, leaving him effectively alone with 12 wounded soldiers who depended entirely on his continued capability to provide assistance. 13 miles remained to friendly lines. 1 day available for mission completion. The morning of Day 5 found Jake barely capable of standing due to severe dehydration, physical exhaustion, multiple muscle strains, bleeding hands, and infected cuts that were compromising his overall health. However, 13 miles to freedom provided the motivation necessary for one final superhuman effort. Jake implemented a continuous carrying rotation system that eliminated rest periods between wounded soldiers, 30 minutes carrying each wounded soldier with immediate transition to the next casualty, pushing through pain barriers and exhaustion levels that exceeded normal human endurance. First rotation, Davis, unconscious and requiring full stretcher support. Second rotation, Johnson, whose bleeding had resumed and whose condition was becoming critical. Third rotation, Martinez, whose leg infection was spreading and causing systemic illness. The rotation continued through all 12 wounded soldiers while Jake maintained forward movement toward their salvation. During the afternoon of Day 5, Jake was no longer certain what was real and what were hallucinations created by extreme exhaustion and psychological stress. He occasionally saw Sergeant Brown walking with their group, heard his wife Sarah calling his name from distant hills, and experienced conversations with family members who were thousands of miles away. However, the wounded soldiers remained undeniably real, their pain was genuine, their dependence on his assistance was absolute, and their lives depended on his ability to distinguish between hallucination and reality long enough to complete their evacuation. Wilson briefly regained consciousness during the afternoon. "Jake, leave me behind. Take the others who have better chances of survival." "Wilson, nobody gets left behind. That's the military code, and it doesn't include exceptions based on survival probability." 6 miles from friendly lines, with Jake's physical capabilities nearly exhausted and his mental state deteriorating rapidly, the distinctive sound of friendly helicopter rotors cut through the afternoon air like a symphony of salvation. "Flare. I need an emergency flare." Jake desperately searched through their remaining equipment for signal devices that could attract the attention of potential rescue aircraft. He located an emergency signaling flare, aimed it toward the open sky, and fired the bright red signal that represented their last hope for survival. The UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter spotted the emergency signal, identified American personnel in distress, and began immediate descent procedures for emergency medical evacuation of the wounded soldiers. Jake collapsed to his knees as the helicopter approached their position. "We made it. We actually made it home." The medical evacuation helicopter carried a full emergency medical team that immediately began triage and treatment procedures for all 12 wounded soldiers while Jake ensured that everyone was safely secured aboard the aircraft before allowing himself to be treated. During the flight to the main base hospital, Jake finally lost consciousness from exhaustion, dehydration, and the accumulated physical stress of carrying 12 wounded soldiers 50 miles through hostile territory over 5 days of continuous movement. The medical team's assessment revealed that Jake was suffering from severe dehydration that threatened kidney function, extensive muscle damage throughout his back and arms, and psychological exhaustion that would require extended recovery time. All 12 wounded soldiers survived the evacuation flight and received appropriate medical treatment at the base hospital. 11 soldiers made complete recoveries and returned to duty or civilian life, while Staff Sergeant Martinez required leg amputation due to infection complications but survived and adapted to his disability with prosthetic assistance. Jake's hospital recovery required 2 weeks of intensive medical treatment for his physical injuries and dehydration, followed by an additional month of physical therapy to restore normal function to muscles that had been severely strained during the evacuation march. During his recovery, Jake visited each rescued soldier to check on their medical progress and recovery status. Their gratitude was overwhelming and provided Jake with the emotional validation that his suffering had achieved meaningful results. "Lieutenant Davis, Jake, you carried me 50 miles when I was unconscious and couldn't help myself. I literally owe you my life and my future." "Corporal Johnson, sir, without your refusal to abandon wounded soldiers, none of us would be here with our families today." "Staff Sergeant Martinez, I lost my leg, but I'm alive and with my family because you refused to accept that carrying 12 wounded soldiers was impossible." Jake was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the military's highest honors for heroic action during aerial operations, in recognition of his extraordinary efforts to save wounded soldiers under impossible circumstances. The award ceremony included senior military leadership and family members of the rescued soldiers. Captain Sullivan's actions represent the finest traditions of military aviation and personal sacrifice. He refused to abandon wounded soldiers despite facing impossible odds and succeeded through determination that exceeded normal human capabilities. However, Jake's primary focus remained on the more meaningful recognition. 11 soldiers had returned to their families and resumed their lives because he had refused to abandon them when abandonment would have been understandable and forgivable. Jake's reunion with his wife Sarah and 8-year-old daughter Emma was deeply emotional, representing the completion of promises made to both his family and his wounded soldiers. Emma greeted him with the directness that only children possess. "Daddy, everyone on TV is saying you carried soldiers home like a superhero. Yes, sweetheart, sometimes we carry people who need our help, even when it's very difficult. Sarah expressed the complex emotions that military families understand. Jake, how did you manage to carry 12 wounded soldiers 50 miles through enemy territory? I can barely comprehend what you accomplished. Sarah, the military code says, leave no man behind, and some codes are more important than personal safety or comfort. Those soldiers trusted me to get them home, and I couldn't break that trust. Months after the evacuation, Jake experienced post-traumatic stress symptoms that included recurring nightmares about Sergeant Brown's death, guilt about not being able to save all 13 soldiers, flashbacks to carrying wounded soldiers through hostile territory, and anxiety about future military operations. Professional therapy sessions helped Jake process the trauma associated with his heroic actions, but he never fully recovered from the psychological impact of Brown's death and the weight of responsibility for 12 other lives. Jake learned that heroic actions often carry long-term psychological costs, and that saving lives doesn't eliminate the emotional trauma associated with extreme stress and life-or-death decision-making. Jake made the difficult journey to visit Sergeant Brown's family, delivering his personal effects and explaining the circumstances of his death during the evacuation march. Brown's wife received Jake with remarkable grace. Jake, thank you for trying to bring my husband home. I know you did everything humanly possible, and I'm grateful that you didn't abandon him even when his survival became unlikely. Brown's young son looked up at Jake with admiration. Mr. Jake, Daddy was a hero because you're a hero. Both of you were brave together. Jake realized that heroism sometimes means accepting failure while maintaining maximum effort, and that attempting to save everyone is more important than successfully saving everyone. Years after the evacuation, Jake maintained regular contact with all 11 rescued soldiers through annual reunions, shared support during difficult times, and mutual understanding that only people who have shared extreme experiences can provide. The rescued soldiers referred to themselves as Jake's dozen, 12 men whose lives had been saved by one pilot's refusal to abandon them when abandonment would have been tactically reasonable and personally safer. Lieutenant Davis became a commercial airline pilot and credited Jake with inspiring his career choice toward aviation focused on passenger safety. Corporal Johnson joined the fire department and specialized in rescue operations, applying lessons learned during their evacuation to civilian emergency response. Staff Sergeant Martinez, despite losing his leg, became an advocate for wounded warriors and demonstrated that physical disabilities couldn't prevent meaningful contributions to society. Each rescued soldier built successful civilian lives and contributed positively to their communities, multiplying the impact of Jake's heroic decision to carry them to safety. And that's Jake Sullivan's Black Hawk Dawn story, the pilot who carried 12 wounded soldiers 50 miles to safety. Here at Last Signal Stories, we believe every soldier's final message deserves to be heard. If this story of endurance, brotherhood, and unbreakable commitment moved you, hit subscribe for more military stories. Drop a comment below. Would you have shown the same determination as Jake? Until next time, stay tuned for the signal.